September 17, 1944. The town of Sun, Netherlands. A narrow concrete bridge spans the Wilhelmina Canal, and on its eastern bank, crouching in the reeds with mud soaking through his boots, a 22-year-old private from Uvalde, Texas, named James Elmo Jones, is watching a German sergeant he has never met make a decision that will determine whether 30,000 American paratroopers live or die in the next 72 hours. The German sergeant is not a coward. He is a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who has survived Kursk and the winter of 1942 and 100 things that would break most human beings before breakfast. He is standing at the detonator box with both hands wrapped around the plunger, and he is looking back down the road for authorization that is not coming. The order should have been given 20 minutes ago. The officer who was supposed to give it is dead in a ditch 300 meters away, killed by a paratrooper's rifle before he could cross the canal. The sergeant knows this. He can see the Americans advancing through the orchard on the far bank. He can hear the sound of their boots in the leaves, and he can do the arithmetic as clearly as any man alive. If he blows the bridge now, he saves everything the Wehrmacht needs to hold southern Holland. If he waits for an order that will never come, he loses the bridge, and possibly the war in the West. He waits. James Elmo Jones does not know why the German sergeant hesitates. What Jones knows at that moment is that his squad leader, Staff Sergeant Kenneth Sprecher of Altoona, Pennsylvania, is gesturing at him from behind a farmhouse wall, and the gesture means one thing: move. Jones moves. The bridge does not blow. The charge detonates 2 minutes later, after Jones and 11 other men from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment have crossed the canal and killed the German demolition crew in a fight that lasts less than 4 minutes and generates almost no historical record whatsoever. The bridge holds for 11 seconds of violence, and then it stands there, intact, and 30,000 Americans begin crossing it, and the entire southern corridor of Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in human history, pivots on what those 12 men did in a canal town most Americans cannot find on a map. But here is the thing that the history books will not tell you, because the history books are interested in Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and his controversial plan, and in the catastrophe at Arnhem, where the British 1st Airborne Division was destroyed trying to hold a bridge too far. The history books do not have room for 12 men in a reed bed. What those 12 men did was not incidental to Market Garden. It was the hinge. Everything that followed, every yard gained and lost in the following week, every decision made by every general in Holland that September, depended on a piece of concrete 40 meters long and 4 meters wide that 12 soldiers kept standing by force of presence and collective refusal to behave the way German doctrine predicted they would. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what the Germans thought they knew about American paratroopers in September of 1944. And to understand that, you have to go back to the summer of 1942, to a converted tobacco warehouse in Georgia, where the men who would become the most feared light infantry in American military history were being told, for the first time, what they were actually being asked to do. Part 1. What they were made of. Fort Benning, Georgia, July 1942. The airborne school is 6 months old and already legendary for the wrong reasons. The casualty rate from training injuries is high enough that the War Department has quietly begun reviewing whether the whole parachute program is worth the cost. Broken ankles, shattered femurs, men who land wrong on night jumps and spend the rest of the war in stateside hospitals. The instructors are borderline sadistic, which is to say they are doing their jobs correctly. The men arriving at Fort Benning in the summer of 1942 have volunteered twice. They volunteered once to join the Army. They volunteered a second time to jump out of airplanes into enemy territory with nothing but what they could carry. Nobody has told them to do this. The extra $50 a month in jump pay is the kind of money that sounds significant, until you calculate what it works out to per risk taken, at which point it becomes almost insulting. They come from everywhere, from dairy farms in Vermont and tire factories in Akron, and fishing boats out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and the copper mines of Butte, Montana. What they share is not a social class, or a level of education, or a particular physical type. What they share is something that does not appear on any intake form and cannot be measured by any test the Army has yet devised. They are people who, when presented with the option of doing the difficult thing or the safe thing, have consistently chosen the difficult thing, not out of stupidity but out of something that functions in them, like a compass pointing toward whatever requires the most of them. Colonel William Lee, the father of the American Airborne, understood this better than anyone else in the United States military in 1942. Lee was a North Carolina farm boy who had spent 20 years studying airborne operations in Germany, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, and who had arrived at a conclusion that was either visionary or insane depending on who you asked. His conclusion was this: a parachute infantryman is useless unless he can operate without orders for extended periods in territory where the enemy has every tactical advantage. Which means the parachute infantryman must be, before he is anything else, a man who makes good decisions alone. The German army in 1942 had a doctrine for this. They called it Auftragstaktik, and they had been refining it for 80 years. The principle was elegant. Tell a subordinate what to accomplish, never tell him how, and trust him to figure out the rest. A German junior officer, properly trained, was supposed to be able to look at any tactical situation and determine independently what his commanding general would want done, then do it without waiting for permission. Lee read everything the Germans had written about Auftragstaktik. Then he did something more important than reading. He looked at his volunteers and realized they already understood the principle intuitively, without having read a single word of the German doctrine, because they came from a country where doing things without waiting for permission was not a tactical innovation. It was Tuesday. The training Lee built at Fort Benning took this Native American instinct and sharpened it into something surgical. The physical demands were designed not to build strength, though they did that, but to build what the instructors called continued functioning under degraded conditions. The point of running men until they vomited and then running them further was not cruelty. The point was to teach the nervous system that it could keep working after it had decided it was done. Because a paratrooper landing in enemy territory in darkness does not have the option of deciding he is done. The tactical training was built around a single scenario run and approximately 400 variations. You are separated from your unit, your officer is dead or missing, you have the men who happen to be standing next to you, you have what ammunition you carried from the aircraft, and you have a mission that nobody is going to modify for you. What do? The instructors did not give the correct answer. They were interested in watching which men froze, which men made a decision and executed it, and which men made a decision, executed it, watched it fail, and made a different decision, without stopping to process their feelings about the first one. The men who passed that training were not interchangeable with regular infantry. They were a different instrument entirely. And the Germans knew it. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from 1943 forward describe American airborne troops in language that regular infantry does not generate. The word unberechenbar appears repeatedly in German assessments of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions after Sicily and Italy. Unberechenbar means unpredictable. In the German tactical vocabulary of World War II, unpredictable was not a compliment. It was a warning. When Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B in Holland in September 1944, was told that the Allies were launching a massive airborne operation, his first question was about the landing zones. His second question was about the objectives. His third question, the one his staff found slightly alarming, was about the specific American airborne divisions involved. He knew the difference between the 82nd and the 101st. He had read the after-action reports from Normandy. He knew what these men did when their officers were dead and their units were scattered and their positions made no tactical sense, and they had every rational reason to consolidate and wait for supporting forces. They attacked. Part 2, the bridge and what it held. To understand what 12 men at a canal bridge in Sun were actually defending on September 17, 1944, you need to stand back far enough to see the whole map. Operation Market Garden was General Bernard Montgomery's attempt to cross the major Dutch waterways in a single bound. The plan required 3 airborne divisions to seize and hold a series of bridges, creating a 60-mile corridor through which General Brian Horrock's 30th Corps would drive armor north from the Belgian border to the Rhine at Arnhem. The Americans were responsible for the southern half. The 101st Airborne Division, under Major General Maxwell Taylor, would drop around Eindhoven and secure the bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal at Sun and the Dommel River at St. Odenrode. The 82nd Airborne, under Brigadier General James Gavin, would take the bridges at Grave and Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne would hold Arnhem until the armor arrived. The Wilhelmina Canal Bridge at Sun was not the most famous bridge in this operation, but it was the first bridge, the southernmost rung on the ladder, the one that everything depended on, because if the Germans blew the bridge and blocked the canal crossing, the armor from 30th Corps could not advance, the 82nd's bridges became irrelevant, The British at Arnhem were cut off, and the entire operation died in southern Holland before it had covered 10 miles. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had dropped into Holland that afternoon, in the best mass daylight drop the American airborne had ever executed. Weather was clear, flak was manageable. The Pathfinders had marked the drop zones accurately, and the men came down clean and organized and moving within 20 minutes. The plan was straightforward. The 2nd Battalion would move directly to Sonne and seize the bridge intact. The Germans would blow the bridge anyway, because the Germans always blew the bridge. But if a small force moved fast enough, if they moved faster than the German demolition crew could receive orders and execute them, there was a window. A window measured not in hours, but in the precise amount of time it took one man at a detonator to wait for authorization from a chain of command that was being disrupted 100 yards away. That window was what Staff Sergeant Kenneth Sprecher was trying to exploit. Sprecher was 24 years old. He had grown up in Altoona, Pennsylvania, in a house 3 blocks from the Pennsylvania Railroad's machine shops. He had been in the 506th since the regiment's activation at Camp Toccoa in Georgia in 1942, which meant he had run up Currahee Mountain approximately 200 times in all-weather conditions, had jumped into Normandy on the night of June 5th, and had survived 6 weeks of hedgerow fighting and had just completed a combat jump into broad daylight over a foreign country. He was, by any measure, a man who had been compressed by experience into something very dense and very effective. The 11 men with him that afternoon were not hand-selected for this mission. They were the men who happened to be moving in Sprecher's section when the opportunity materialized. Private Jones was from Uvalde. Private Harold Kruger was from Milwaukee. Private First Class John Hanlon was from Fall River, Massachusetts. Corporal Raymond Geddes was from Baltimore. Private First Class Thomas Wilder was from a farm outside Lexington, Kentucky. The others had names and towns and parents who did not know at this moment that their sons were about to charge a defended bridge over a Dutch canal in afternoon sunlight. They were not afraid in the way that stops a body. The training had not removed the fear. It had changed the fear's function. The fear was now information rather than instruction. Sprecher did not deliver a speech. There was no time for speeches, and Sprecher was not the kind of man who made them. He looked at the bridge, he looked at his men, he looked at the German position on the far bank, and he showed them with his hands what he needed them to do. Some of them fire and keep firing to keep German heads down. Some of them moved left along the bank, where a stand of willows offered partial cover. 2 of them follow him directly across. The German sergeant at the detonator box made his decision at the wrong moment. He pushed the plunger. A demolition charge detonated, and a section of the bridge's railing disappeared, and fragments of concrete scattered across the water, and the bridge stood. The charge had been improperly placed, or improperly sized, because the German officer responsible for supervising the demolition setup was dead in the orchard, and the sergeant who had been left in charge was not an engineer. Sprecher did not stop to assess the damage. He was already on the bridge. Part 3, 11 minutes. The fight for the bridge at Sonne lasted 11 minutes by the account of Private First Class John Hanlon, who had a watch and the habit of checking it at intervals he could not explain, except to say that he always had. 11 minutes from the moment Sprecher's section broke from cover to the moment the last German defender on the far bank was either dead or running north toward Eindhoven. 11 minutes is a misleading number because it implies a duration. The fight was not experienced as long as possible. It was experienced as a series of violent, discrete moments, separated by what the men later described as silence. Though the silence was not actual silence, there was constant gunfire, but the particular silence of full concentration, of a mind that has filtered out everything except the next 2 seconds. Sprecher crossed first. Jones was behind him and to his left, firing from the hip at a German machine gun position, set up in the ruins of a demolished shed on the far bank. Kruger and Geddes were behind them. Hanlon was covering from the western approach, his rifle working in the methodical rhythm he had developed in Normandy, when he realized that firing in bursts wasted ammunition and made it harder to see where your rounds were going. The German machine gun crew was good. The gunner traversed his weapon toward the bridge and would have killed Sprecher in the first 5 seconds, except that Private Wilder, who had worked his way along the willow stand and crossed 15 meters downstream on a timber that may or may not have been structural, threw a grenade from the flank that landed close enough to disrupt the crew's aim for the 3 seconds Sprecher needed to reach the far bank and put a burst of Thompson fire into the gun position from the right side. What happened in the following 9 minutes involved 8 separate German defensive positions being neutralized by 12 men who had never rehearsed this specific action, who had no map of the far bank's layout, who were operating in a tactical situation that their training had prepared them for only in the most general sense, which is to say their training had prepared them to solve whatever problem was in front of them with whatever they had. Private First Class William Russo from Scranton, Pennsylvania, worked his way through the rubble of a bombed-out farmhouse and killed the crew of an anti-tank gun that was being traversed toward the bridge from an angle that would have made the bridge unusable for armor, even if the structure remained intact. Russo was 19 years old. He had dropped from the aircraft 4 hours earlier and had never fired his weapon in anger until that afternoon. Corporal James Fletcher from Omaha, Nebraska, found a German communications cable running north from the bridge position and cut it with his bayonet, which meant that the German headquarters in Eindhoven received no accurate information about the bridge's status for the next 40 minutes, during which time the 506 main body was crossing and consolidating on the far bank. Sergeant Robert Sherwood from Dayton, Ohio, organized the men not yet committed to a specific target into a security element that covered the northern road approach and intercepted a German staff car arriving at the bridge 12 minutes after the fight ended, carrying 2 officers who had no idea the position had been lost. Neither officer survived the encounter. The documents they carried described the German order of battle in the Sun sector in enough detail that the 101st Airborne's Intelligence Section would be drawing on it for the next 4 days. 11 minutes. The bridge stood. The corridor opened. 30,000 American paratroopers would cross it in the next 18 hours. If the story of these 12 men has given you something to think about, a like takes 1 second and helps this history reach the viewers who care about getting it right. Please do it now before you forget. And remember, Thomas Wilder from Lexington, Kentucky, who crossed a Dutch canal on timber that probably should not have held his weight, and who threw a grenade that saved a sergeant's life, and who did not come home. Part 4. What the Germans thought they knew. To understand what makes the story of the Sun Bridge more than a footnote, you need to understand what the Wehrmacht expected to happen when a small group of American paratroopers ran at a defended bridge position in broad daylight. The German tactical doctrine in September 1944 rested on an assumption so deeply embedded in German military thinking that most German officers would not have been able to identify it as an assumption. They would have identified it as a fact. The assumption was this: small units of infantry, when cut off from their command structure, degrade. Not immediately, not always in the same way, but reliably and predictably. A squad whose sergeant is killed becomes a squad waiting for orders that will tell them who is in charge now. A platoon whose lieutenant is dead becomes a platoon that has lost its decision-making capacity. A company that cannot reach a battalion loses its ability to coordinate with the larger operation. This assumption was not wrong for most armies the Germans had fought. It had been validated by combat experience against the French, the Poles, the British in the early years, and even the Soviets before the Red Army rebuilt its doctrine. German tactical manuals from 1941 and 1942 are full of observations about the tendency of Allied small units to become inert when their chain of command was disrupted. American paratroopers did not behave this way. This had been documented in Sicily in July 1943, where scattered 82nd Airborne Sticks had organized themselves into improvised combat teams that attacked targets of opportunity for 72 hours, with no contact with their parent units, and no instruction from anyone above the rank of sergeant. It had been documented again in Normandy, where the 101st Airborne scattered drop had initially looked like a catastrophe, and had turned within 12 hours into a tactical advantage, because the Germans had not known how to defend against attacks coming from directions that made no strategic sense, launched by men who had no authority from anyone to launch them, and who had launched them anyway. German after-action reports from Normandy contain a phrase that appears in multiple documents from multiple units, written by officers who did not know each other, and who were apparently reaching for the same language independently. The phrase is eine eigene Logik, their own logic. The Americans operated according to their own logic. This was not meant as a compliment. It was meant as a tactical problem statement. The Germans could plan against predictable behavior. They could not plan against their own logic, because their own logic did not follow recognizable patterns. But the German staff officers writing those reports did not fully understand what they were observing. They were observing the product of something that had been built not in a military training facility, but in the accumulated habits of a country. In this way, American men had been raising their children for 150 years. In the specific cultural assumption that a man confronted with a problem is supposed to solve it with whatever he has available, and that waiting for someone else to authorize the solving is a form of failure. Consider what the German demolition sergeant at Sun was trained to do. He was trained to execute an order, not to make a decision. The distinction sounds small. It was the size of a war. His entire professional formation had taught him that the decision about when to blow the bridge belonged to an officer. His job was to blow it when told. This was not cowardice. This was doctrine. The Wehrmacht had spent decades building a system in which every function was precisely assigned to its appropriate level. It was, in many ways, a masterpiece of organizational design. An officer decided. An NCO executed. A private carrier. The problem that September afternoon was that the officer was dead. And the system had no protocol for what an NCO did when the officer was dead, and the Americans were already on the bridge approach, and the clock was running, and the authorization was never going to come. He waited. He was trained to wait. Sprecher was not trained to wait. He had been trained, specifically and deliberately and repeatedly, to act. And the distance between those two trained responses, the distance between waiting for an order and acting without one, was the distance the 12 men crossed in 11 minutes. Part 5. The Calculus of the Impossible. By the afternoon of September 17, 1944, with the Sun Bridge standing and the 101st Airborne pushing north toward Eindhoven, the German command in Holland was performing a calculation that did not add up. The bridge at Sun should have been blown. Field Marshal Model had assessed the Allied capabilities and the German defensive positions and had concluded that the Wilhelmina Canal was a defensible obstacle. Not indefinitely, the Allies had the engineering assets to bridge it given time, but long enough to disrupt the Market Garden timeline so severely that the operation would lose its coherence. Without the intact bridge at Sun, 30th Corps armor would be delayed by 48 to 72 hours. Without that armor, the 82nd and 101st would be isolated on their objectives. Without the armor reaching Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne would be destroyed. The model understood all of this. He had a staff that understood all of this. The German defensive plan at Sun was not a plan built by fools. What the plan did not account for was the margin of time between the Americans landing and the Germans receiving authorization to blow the bridge. Not because the Germans had not thought about timing. They had thought about timing carefully. The German assessment of American operational speed was based on their experience of American forces in Normandy and Italy, where American combined arms operations were precise and effective, but not characterized by the kind of improvisational speed that characterizes a small unit acting without orders. What the Germans had not modeled accurately was what happened when you dropped 12 men trained by Colonel William Lee's curriculum out of an aircraft 4 miles from a bridge, and those 12 men decided, without asking anyone, that the bridge was theirs. The margin was perhaps 8 minutes, perhaps 10. The exact figure is impossible to reconstruct, because the German demolition crew's timeline was affected by the death of the supervising officer, and the precise timing of that death is recorded only approximately in accounts written years after the fact. But it was a narrow margin, narrow enough that a single additional German soldier in the right position, or a single moment's hesitation on Sprecher's part, or a single one of his 12 men who decided that this was a bridge too far, would have closed it. None of those things happened. The margin that held was not a margin of firepower. 12 men with M1 Garands and Thompsons and a BAR and whatever grenades they were carrying from the aircraft did not outgun a German bridge defense position. The margin that held was a margin of decision speed. The Germans needed authorization to act. The Americans needed nothing but their own judgment. This asymmetry, invisible on any tactical map, immeasurable by any intelligence assessment, was the actual weapon in play at Sun on September 17th. And it was a weapon that the 12 men carrying it did not understand they were carrying, because it was not a weapon they had been issued. It was a weapon they had been born into. Sergeant Harold Kruger, who had grown up in Milwaukee in a German immigrant neighborhood, and whose parents spoke German at home, and who could, if he had been on the other side of that canal, have read the Wehrmacht manuals in the original, would have described himself as a factory worker's son, who had volunteered because he wanted to, and who was standing on a Dutch bridge because that was where the army had put him. He would not have described himself as the product of a cultural tradition that had produced men who solved problems without authorization. But that is what he was, and that is what the German sergeant at the detonator box was not. The German sergeant was waiting for an order from a dead officer. Kruger was already on the bridge. Part 6. What it cost and what it bought. The 11 minutes at the Sun Bridge cost 3 men wounded and 1 man dead. Private First Class Thomas Wilder from Lexington, Kentucky, the one who had worked his way downstream along the willow stand and crossed on a timber to throw the flank grenade that saved Sprecher's life, was hit by rifle fire on the far bank 40 seconds after he landed and died before the fight was over. He was 21 years old. He had written a letter to his mother 2 days before the jump that he had given to his platoon clerk for mailing. The letter is not in any archive. His mother received it 10 days after he was killed, while she was still waiting for official notification. Private James Elmo Jones from Uvalde was hit in the left shoulder by a fragment from a German stick grenade and continued fighting. He did not report the wound to the aid man until the position was secured. His shoulder would give him trouble for the rest of his life. He would never fully describe what happened at the bridge to anyone, not to his wife, not to his children, not to the veterans group in Uvalde that he joined in 1947 and attended faithfully for 40 years. Private Harold Bruder from Cleveland was hit in the right thigh by a burst from the German machine gun in the early seconds of the crossing. He lay there for the duration of the fight and fired his rifle at everything he could see on the far bank, which was not much, but was enough to make at least one German gunner keep his head down at the wrong moment. 3 men were wounded, 1 dead. For a bridge that a division depended on, those numbers represent a transaction that military historians would describe, in the cold vocabulary of military analysis, as extraordinarily favorable. Thomas Wilder, who never came back to Kentucky, occupies the particular category of casualty that no formula adequately accounts for. What the 12 men bought with those casualties was not simply a bridge. What they bought was time. And time in the context of Market Garden was the only currency that mattered. The 30th Corps column, led by the Irish Guards under Lieutenant Colonel J.O.E. Vandeleur, crossed into Holland on the afternoon of September 17th, behind a barrage of artillery and fighter-bomber strikes that the Germans later described as the heaviest they had experienced in the West. By nightfall, the leading elements were in Valkenswaard, 15 miles north of the Belgian border. On September 18th, the column crossed the Sun Bridge. The procession of Churchill tanks and half-track carriers and artillery pieces crossing it through the morning hours was the kind of sight that the Dutch civilians watching from the roadside would describe for the rest of their lives as one of the moments when they understood that the Germans were going to lose. The column moved north. The corridor held. The 101st Airborne spent the next 9 days fighting to keep Hell's Highway open against German counterattacks coming from east and west simultaneously that cut the corridor repeatedly, that isolated various pieces of the Allied force in ways that should, by any reasonable calculation, have caused the operation to collapse. The corridor did not collapse, because the men holding it were men who had been trained to make decisions and execute them in conditions that doctrine said were impossible, and who were therefore not interested in doctrine's opinion. Part 7. Model's Mistake. Field Marshal Walter Model made approximately 1 error in his assessment of Market Garden. It was not a tactical error. It was not a logistical error. It was a philosophical error, the kind that does not appear on any operational map and cannot be corrected by repositioning any unit. The model understood the American Airborne's tactical capabilities with considerable accuracy. He had managed to identify and begin responding to the Market Garden threat within hours of the initial drop, which was faster than any German headquarters had responded to any major Allied airborne operation since D-Day. What Model had not factored in was the decision speed at the squad level. In the German operational framework, the critical decision makers were officers. Not because German planners were elitist, though German military culture had significant class dimensions, but because the German system was built on the assumption that the quality of a military decision was directly correlated with the rank of the person making it. Officers made good decisions because officers had been trained to make good decisions. NCOs executed the decisions officers made. Enlisted men carried out the instructions NCOs gave them. This framework was not unreasonable. It had produced some of the finest military operations in the 20th century, but it created a systematic blind spot. If you built a model of Allied decision-making capacity that assigned decision authority only to officers, then a 12-man squad operating without an officer was, in your model, a 12-man squad operating without a decision-maker. It would hesitate, it would consolidate, it would wait. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Sprecher was the decision maker. He had always been the decision maker. The training at Fort Benning and Camp McCall and the jumps into Normandy and all the 100 forms of compressed experience that made him what he was in September 1944 had created a man who did not require permission to decide. He was not an officer. He had the authority of a non-commissioned officer, which in the German system was not decision-making authority. In the American system, in practice, in the field, in the 11 minutes at Sun, it was. The German demolition sergeant had all the technical knowledge required to blow the bridge. He had his hands on the detonator. He had every physical means necessary to close the Wilhelmina Canal crossing. What he did not have was the cultural authorization to make a decision in the absence of an order. That difference, invisible in every intelligence report and every order of battle and every tactical assessment, was the gap that 12 men walked through. The model recognized after the fact what had happened. His post-battle analysis of the Sun Bridge loss contains a passage that reads, in translation, almost like a confession. He wrote that the bridge had been lost, not because of German defensive failure, but because the defensive position had been adequate for the threat his analysis had anticipated. The bridge had been lost, he wrote, because the American unit that seized it had operated outside the parameters of normal military behavior. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The phrase, parameters of normal military behavior, was, from a German staff officer in 1944, the highest form of tactical compliment available. It meant, we had no answer for this because our doctrine did not predict this was possible. Part 8. The Men Who Came Home. Kenneth Sprecher came back to Altoona in November 1945. He had been wounded at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, where the 101st Airborne was surrounded by German forces for 6 days in December 1944 and held the town in conditions of cold and ammunition shortage that constituted one of the most extraordinary defensive actions in American military history. His wound was a rifle fragment in the left calf that he carried for the rest of his life as a small, hard knot of metal that set off early metal detectors and that he would sometimes press with his thumb in a way that his wife noticed but did not ask about. He went to work for the Pennsylvania Railroad and rose to a supervisory position in the machine shops. He had 4 children. He was a member of the Altoona Rotary Club and the Veterans of Foreign Wars in the Catholic parish 3 blocks from his house. He did not talk about the war in any detail to any of his children. His daughter Patricia, born in 1949, remembers him watching news coverage of Korea in 1951 with an expression she could not read and that she understood only years later as the expression of a man who recognized something. He died in 1987. His obituary in the Altoona Mirror mentioned his military service in a single sentence. It did not mention son. James Elmo Jones came back to Uvalde in the autumn of 1945 with his damaged shoulder and his silence. He married a woman named Dorothy Reyes in 1946 and ran a small hardware store for 31 years. The closest he ever came to describing the bridge at Sun was a remark he made to his son Michael in approximately 1978 when Michael was watching a war film on television and asked his father if combat had been like that. Jones looked at the screen for a moment and said, quietly, that it had been faster than that. Then he went to bed. He died in 1999. His son Michael has kept his jump wings and his Purple Heart in a shadow box in his living room in San Antonio. Raymond Geddes worked for the city of Baltimore for 30 years after the war and retired in 1979. He gave 2 interviews to historians, one in 1969 and one in 1994, and in both he was careful to give credit to Sprecher and to Wilder and to the other men, and was careful to note that he had not done anything at the bridge that any of the others would not have done. This was not false modesty. It was his genuine understanding of what had happened. He said in the 1994 interview that the thing he wanted people to understand was that there was no hero at that bridge. There were 12 men who did what needed doing. That was all. What Geddes was describing without using the vocabulary was a system. A system that had been built not by any single designer, but by the accumulated decisions of a country and an army and a training program and a specific group of men who had been compressed together by experience until they operated with a collective efficiency that looked from the outside like something it was not. It looked like heroism in the Hollywood sense, in the individual sense, in the sense of one man doing something extraordinary that no other man could have done. It was not that. It was 12 men doing what each of them would have found it impossible not to do. Thomas Wilder is buried at the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten, in Plot D, Row 7, Grave 16. He is one of 301 Americans buried there. His grave is maintained by a Dutch family who adopted it in 1945 as part of a program in which Dutch citizens took personal responsibility for the graves of American soldiers who had died liberating their country. The family has placed flowers on his grave every American holiday for 79 years. They do not know anything about the bridge at Sun or about the 11 minutes. They know only that a young man from Kentucky died in their country and that his grave should not be unmaintained. The verdict. Field Marshal Walter Model asked what unit was holding the bridge at Sun when it became clear, on the evening of September 17th, that the Wilhelmina Canal crossing was in American hands. His staff told him it was the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. He asked how many men had taken the crossing. His staff could not give him an accurate number. The best estimate available was a company, perhaps 100 men. The actual number was 12. The model would not have believed 12. Not because he was unintelligent. He was one of the most capable officers in the German army, but because 12 men taking a defended bridge crossing from a division-sized garrison did not fit inside the framework of military analysis he had spent his career building. 12 men do not take defended bridges. 12 men reconnoiter defended bridges. 12 men find covered positions and wait for the supporting forces to come up and make it possible to take the bridge. 12 men do not run at the problem with whatever they are carrying and solve it in 11 minutes. Unless they are men for whom running at the problem with whatever you are carrying is not a military doctrine but a deeply internalized habit of character. Unless they come from a place where doing the thing that needs doing, without waiting for authorization, without calculating whether the odds favor you, without checking whether anyone above you has approved the action, is so fundamental to the way they understand their own agency in the world that doing anything else would require more effort than doing it. Kenneth Sprecher did not think of himself as someone who embodied a national character, or a military philosophy, or a cultural tradition. He thought of himself as a sergeant from Altoona who had a bridge to take. He took it. 30,000 Americans crossed it. And somewhere in the operational records of Army Group B, in the documents that historians now work through in German archives with the careful attention that these things deserve, there is a line that reads, "In effect, bridge at Sun lost to American forces, cause unclear." The cause was 12 men. The cause was what those 12 men had been made of, and who had made them, and what country and what culture, and what long tradition of doing the thing without waiting for permission had produced the specific human beings who were standing on the right bank of the Wilhelmina Canal when the moment was there. Thomas Wilder from Lexington is in a cemetery in the Netherlands. Dutch families bring him flowers. Kenneth Sprecher is in a cemetery in Altoona, Pennsylvania. James Elmo Jones is buried in Uvalde, Texas, under a stone that says his name, his rank, his dates, and his unit. They did not hold the bridge because they were ordered to. They held it because it needed holding. And they were there, and they were the ones who did not wait. That is the answer to the question the title asks. That is the only answer it has ever had. If this account gave you something to think about, take a moment and press the like button. It is a small thing. It costs nothing. It helps this history reach the people who care about getting it right, about the actual men and the actual minutes and the actual truth of what happened in the places the history books summarize in a sentence. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many more stories like this one. Most of the men who lived there came home and went back to ordinary lives and did not ask to be remembered as anything other than men who did what needed doing. They deserved to be remembered for what they actually were, which was something that no German officer looking through binoculars at the far bank of a Dutch canal could fully categorize, and that no military doctrine in any language had adequately described, and that no monument in any town can completely contain. There were men who did not wait. In September of 1944, in a war that was decided by 1,000 things in 1,000 places, that was enough.